We want to welcome you to a training from the State of Tennessee's Office of Criminal Justice Programs on documenting time for grant-funded employees. We will be covering this topic as a way to provide technical assistance for agencies that receive grant funds for salaries. So let's get started with the overview of the objectives for today.
Today we'll be going through the OCJP requirements for grant-funded employees and documentation of their time. We'll be going through examples of how to document your time, where to find more information on this in our manual, and common questions.
There are a few different types of grant-funded employees for the purpose of this discussion. When an agency receives a grant contract, the budget may include funding for personnel in different ways. One example is an employee who spends 100% of their time on the grant project, and their salary and sometimes benefits are 100% reimbursable to the grant. These employees do not work on any other projects. They don't work on any activities outside of the scope of the project or any activities unallowable for federally funded time. Next is an example of someone whose salary is not fully funded by the grant, anything less than 100%. And so some other fund source covers a portion of their salary and potentially they work on other projects as well. Next is a grant budget that includes funds for salaries, but those funds are used to meet the grantee match required by the fund source. The time is still documented and the funds for this salary, which are paid with a different fund source as match, are still included on invoices in order to demonstrate the match. And then lastly, there can be in-kind match funds in the form of the value of volunteer time spent contributing to the grant project. And this time must be thoroughly documented as well.
So employees that with 100% on a single federal award means simply that employees that are funded from a single federal award. So that would be someone who is 100% VOCA, 100% JAG, 100% STOP, etc. Having an employee pay 100% from a single federal award for an extended period of time, meaning 6 months or more, and that employee needs to complete the certification of time charged to a single award form. This form must be completed by the employee and their supervisor if the employee will be on that single federal award for more than 6 months, or 6 months or longer. This form needs to be retained and signed in the employee's personnel file and will be reviewed during program monitoring. More information about this can be found in the Tennessee federal regulations.
There are a few different scenarios for staff that are funded less than 100% from a single fund source. So if you're partially funded by a fund source, it can look a couple different ways. So we've got some examples here. Example, employee A is 60% VOCA funded and 40% STOP funded. So these are the estimates that are on those contract budgets, but the employee will document their actual time spent on these two fund sources. Employee B, for example, is 90% VOCA funded, estimated on the budget, and estimated to be 10% funded through some other funding source. And then employee C is we have someone who has just a small amount of their time on the project, maybe 5 or 10% on VOCA, and then 95% with other funding. So subrecipients must have a system in place to provide an accurate accounting of the time spent on each one of the OCJP funded projects. The system should reflect the actual daily time worked by each staff on the grant related activities.
So for using salaries or volunteer time as match, it's pretty similar to grant-funded time. So salaries or volunteer time can be utilized as match for those grant fund sources that require match. Staff and volunteer time that is utilized as match is required to be documented as the same as grant-funded time. We must, so an example of this would be a bookkeeper that is listed at 10% cash match. That 10% of that bookkeeper's time that is used as match must meet all grant funded requirements. That must mean that the work must be grant allowable and time must be documented. Another example of this would be the agency uses an in-kind volunteer hours as match. That volunteer time that's being charged for match must meet all grant-funded requirements. Work must be grant allowable and must be documented.
So when you're creating a system for grant funded staff that are not working 100% on a single grant project, we need to create a system for documenting how much of that employee's time is being charged to the grant. The system needs to show the total number of hours spent on each grant funded project per day. So not the exact time, such as from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., but the total number of hours spent on the project and then how many hours on each of the various grant activities. So we have some examples here. There's a couple different ways you can do it. And if you have questions, you can work with your program manager. But one example is a timesheet, the timesheet that they use for their day to incorporate the activities and the grant hours onto that timesheet. So the timesheet would show directly on there that there were 2 hours for court accompaniment, and those are attributed to VOCA, for example. Or a quarter hour was spent on notes or file updates or emails, and then that is attributed to VOCA. And then at the end of that timesheet, or somewhere on the timesheet, you'll have the total number of hours being charged to each OCJP funded grant for that day. Another way to do it is keep your timesheet separate and then have a separate activity log to supplement the timesheet, which includes a list of allowable activities performed. So what they worked on for that day, they can use summaries of the type of activities, and then they'll have a total number of hours for each. So this is kind of the same as above, 2 hours on court accompaniment, et cetera. So there's a couple different ways that you can structure it, and you can go over it with your program manager once you have an idea of how you want to do it, or if you want to see if the way that the system that you have in place now is acceptable.
So here's just an example, a visual example of what we were talking about on the previous slide. So you can see here on 3.1, this individual had 2 hours on VOCA, another hour on VOCA, and 5.5 hours in general. And so that 2 hours in VOCA was, they broke it down even further and just explained that that was case management. And then the 1 hour was grant administration, where they were working on a report. So you can see here how you can kind of dive into it a little bit more and show the specific activities of what has been done in that allotted time that's on the timesheet.
So where can you find more information? So first you can contact your program manager. Your program manager is going to be the expert on your projects and the staff on your projects, and can help answer questions about your system. You can also refer to the OCJP Grants Manual, Chapter 6, Personnel Policies and Procedures. Section 5 is the section in that chapter specifically for the personnel paid 100% from a single federal award, and that is a link to the that chapter of the manual.
Some common questions that folks have had regarding documenting time. If staff is paid less than 10% from a grant-funded source, do they need to document their time? So 10% and under, folks who are funded 10% and under do need a timesheet, but they do not need that activity tracking. So we still need to see how many hours they're attributing to their grant source, but we don't need the activity tracking. Another question we hear a lot is, do I look at my percentage and divide my time out based on that? No, you do not. The percentage is a rough estimate of the time working on a project. Time charged to the grant must be actual time worked. So if you are working on this grant for 2 hours on Monday and you don't work anything on the grant on Tuesday, you will not charge any time on Tuesday. So it really needs to show the true reflection of actual time worked. Do I need to tell my program manager if my percentage changes with time worked? If the program or if the percentage changes within 5 to 10% or so, approval and notification are not needed. If your time is worked is trending much higher or lower than 5 or 10%, you would need to talk to your program manager to discuss that change and what possible avenues you could take with your program manager to address that situation directly. If you have any
And
specific, Oh, go ahead, go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. I'll just
No,
add
it's
one
just
more common question.
sure.
If you have a staff member who is 100% funded, or maybe slightly under 100% funded, like 90 or 95%, maybe they received a raise, in the middle of the year, and their salary is now supplemented through another fund source, but they are still spending 100% of their time on the project and on federally allowable activities. You can talk to your program manager about if the 100% um, the certification for time spent on a single award is still a possibility for them to use instead of documenting their time if they're still 100% working on the project.
Great.
Okay, so if you have any other questions, just reach out to your program manager and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.